Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're opening a window onto one of history's really profound economic catastrophes. But we're looking at it not just as, a financial failure.
Right, more as a chilling moral and political lesson.
Exactly. We're immersing ourselves in Adam Fergusson's definitive 1975 account, When Money Dies. It chronicles the hyperinflationary nightmare, really, of the Weimar Republic between 1919 and 1923.
Yeah, it's an absolutely essential text. And our mission today, I think, is to understand how a modern, industrialized state systematically destroyed its own currency.
And in doing so, destroyed its own moral foundation.
Precisely. Laid waste to the moral and social fabric of its people. We're trying to extract those enduring warnings, the ones that go far beyond just the economics pages.
And the scale, just to set the scene, the scale of this collapse is almost unbelievable. We have to start with the numbers, don't we?
You really do. Before World War I, say 1913, the German mark was solid, stable, roughly equal in value to the British shilling, the French franc, a respected global currency.
Okay, standard European currency.
Right. But by the end of 1923, the mark was, mathematically dead. Physically useless. The collapse reached this point of just staggering absurdity.
You mean the trillion mark figure?
Yeah. A single British shilling would have bought you up to 1 trillion marks. That's 1,000 billion.
Wow.
You're talking about a currency reduced to 1 million millionth of its former value. The phrase wealth evaporation, it just doesn't cut it.
It's genuinely difficult for us today to even conceptualize that kind of financial annihilation. But what's so fascinating, and you see this in the source material, is how this 20th century European tragedy, it directly affirms a principle the American founders learned centuries earlier.
Oh, absolutely. The source material draws that parallel very clearly. You had the collapse of the Continental currency during the Revolutionary War, that whole experience.
You used the phrase, not worth the Continental.
Exactly. That chaos was formative. It drove the founders' conviction that sound money is fundamentally a moral safeguard. It protects liberty. They saw firsthand how monetary chaos just destroys public trust, breeds political instability.
Which explains why the U.S. Constitution has that very specific, almost rigid mandate, requiring only gold and silver coin as legal tender for debts.
They recognize that debased money inevitably leads to debased government. And that's the core thesis we'll see play out so tragically in Weimar Germany.
That once a nation treats its currency as just a political tool, something to manipulate for short-term gain.
Rather than a moral trust.
Right. Then its freedom is in immediate danger.
And the stage for Germany's tragedy was set right after World War I. The nation was crippled by the Treaty of Versailles, saddled with these colossal reparation demands.
Politically fractured internally.
Terribly fractured. And led by a desperately weak government that saw the printing press as its only way out. The immediate and ultimately disastrous answer to every single bill.
Okay, so let's unpack the origins of this disaster, because it wasn't just a post-war thing, was it? The roots go deeper back into the war itself.
Oh yeah, Fergusson traces it right back to Germany's wartime financing choices. This started well before 1919.
And the key figure there was Karl Helfrich, the financial advisor.
That's right. He made this, catastrophic policy decision. Finance the war almost exclusively through borrowing, specifically war loans, not through sufficient taxation.
Why? What was the thinking there?
The logic, or maybe the gamble, was that Germany would win the war quickly, grab rich territories, and then force the defeated enemies to pay off all that debt.
So they decided to avoid the immediate political pain of taxes by basically betting everything on future conquest. How did that bite them?
It was profoundly corrosive from the start. War spending just vastly exceeded revenues. To cover the gap, the amount of money in circulation had already increased fivefold by 1917.
While actual goods were getting scarcer because of the war economy.
Exactly. So you had this huge monetary excess, way too many marks, chasing way too few goods right from the beginning, and the reliance on war loans. Well, when the debt was finally paid off, it was paid with paper that was worth less and less. It completely wiped out the savings of patriotic Germans who'd bought the loans.
Which is a stark contrast to Britain, right? They imposed harsh taxes, which was painful up front.
Very painful, but socially, it was arguably more equitable. The pain was immediate, yes, but the financial system itself wasn't fundamentally destabilized in the same way. Germany, by kicking the can down the road, created this huge moral hazard. The government's promises were built on a fantasy.
And then the post-war situation just poured salt on the wounds.
Absolutely. The Treaty of Versailles inflicted heavy territorial losses. Germany lost about a seventh of its pre-war land, key resources like coal, iron, potash. Their industrial capacity was slashed just as these massive reparation demands landed.
And Fergusson argues those demands, that insupportable weight, basically forced their hand, pushed them towards the printing press to the utter exclusion of other, more desirable policies.
It certainly encouraged it. The government felt cornered, desperate. The press seemed like the only politically survivable path, even if it was economic suicide.
But the psychology around this, the denial within the Reichsbank itself, that's almost the most shocking part of this early period.
It really is. Their official creed, their mantra, was Mark Gleich.
Mark. A mark is a mark. Paper or gold, same thing.
Right. A paper mark was, in their view, the moral and legal equivalent of a gold mark, which was just a dangerous, fatal illusion.
Why was that specific belief so damaging for ordinary Germans?
Well, it encouraged people, especially the cautious middle class, the savers. It encouraged them to trust the currency long after the danger signs were flashing red. It trapped their life savings in paper that was rapidly losing value. They were told by their own government, their central bank, that marks were safe.
And there's that anecdote from Erna von Pustau, the merchant's daughter. She noted how people talked about prices rising. They'd say, the dollar is going up again.
Yes. They completely failed to see that their own mark was falling because the price figures they saw every day in marks were constantly going up, up, up. It created this optical illusion.
So they focused on the rising price of foreign currency or bread or whatever,
instead of the evaporation of their own money's value. It was a failure of perspective, really, that made it almost impossible for people to react rationally, to protect themselves.
So this early inflation, 1920, 1921, it was already incredibly destructive, but it didn't hit everyone the same way, did it?
Not at all. It was almost like a silent class war waged through monetary policy. People on fixed incomes, salaries, savings, insurance payouts, pensions.
The backbone of the German middle class.
Exactly. They were, quote, the most hard hit. Fergusson gives the example. A pre-war annual income of 10,000 marks used to be a fair competence. Pretty comfortable. Suddenly, it wasn't enough for even the barest necessities. Their financial stability was just annihilated.
But the labor sector, the unions, they seemed to manage better in this early phase. How did that work?
The trade unions were very effective, actually. They focused relentlessly on one thing, winning wage increases that kept pace with the soaring cost of living. If you have a pliant government and an even more pliant monetary system, the Reichsbank essentially just rubber-stamped every wage demand by printing the money needed to pay for it.
And this feeds into what the source calls the hidden subsidy. This wasn't just the government failing to tax properly. It was actively shifting wealth away from the middle class.
Precisely. The government passed rent restriction acts, freezing rents at absurdly low levels. They subsidized basic goods, rail travel, food. And who paid for it all?
The printing press. Which means savers, ultimately.
Exactly. So the beneficiaries were the German worker, who got wage increases and subsidized living costs, and the German employer, who benefited from those subsidized wages. The freezing of rents, for instance, just wiped out the income of middle-class property owners, effectively transferring wealth to the tenants.
And because the government was basically subsidizing wages through inflation and cheap food and housing, German exports suddenly became super competitive internationally.
Right. Employers had artificially low labor costs. Workers got rising nominal wages, even if the real value was debatable. And the state footed the bill by destroying the wealth of its most prudent citizens.
It's an incredible economic sleight of hand.
It really was. The seeds of ruin were sown right there in that profoundly unfair distribution of pain. It liquidated the savings, the security, the social stability of the very class that should have been the democratic bedrock of the Weimar Republic.
Okay, so by 1922, things go from bad to worse. That steady decline of the mark turns into a terrifying freefall. What was the catalyst? What pushed it over the edge?
The big trigger, according to Fergusson, was the assassination of Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau in the summer of 22.
Why him specifically?
Rathenau was seen as the main proponent of fulfillment, basically, trying to meet the reparation demands, however painful. His murder signaled political chaos, that the extremists were gaining ground, that the state couldn't maintain order.
And the market reaction was immediate.
Instantaneous. The mark just slid off its already shaky plateau. It went from around 1,300 to the pound to 2,200 almost overnight. The acceleration began right there.
And this is where the Reichsbank president, Dr. Havenstein, becomes this sort of tragic figure of institutional blindness.
Absolutely. He was declared autonomous in May 1922, supposedly independent. But instead of using that independence for restraint, he seemed to double down.
He went on, as Fergusson puts it, merrily turning the handle of the printing press.
Completely unconscious of its disastrous effect. And his rationale was key to understanding the depth of the self-deception. Havenstein genuinely believed he was simply fulfilling his duty to supply the demand for money, the demand for a medium of exchange.
Wait, so he saw the fact that people needed more and more paper notes just to buy things? He saw that as proof the economy needed more currency, not that his currency was becoming worthless.
That's exactly it. He viewed the absolutely astronomical rise in note circulation, from 77 billion marks in 1920 to literally trillions by 1923. He saw that as the result of prices going up, the result of depreciation, not the fundamental cause.
So he absolved the Reichsbank of responsibility.
Completely. And by doing that, he felt morally obligated in a twisted way to keep printing faster and faster, just to provide enough notes for people to conduct transactions at these ever higher nominal prices. The bank had totally lost sight of its core job, protecting the value of the currency.
And the pace of collapse just defied all logic. The numbers became meaningless, didn't they?
Utterly ludicrous. They shattered any connection to reality. Fergusson uses this amazing data point. By October 1923, the number of marks you needed to equal 1 British pound sterling was equivalent to the number of yards between the Earth and the Sun.
That's not economics, that's surrealism.
It really is. And Dr. Schock, he pointed out that the money you needed to buy one single egg in late 1923, 5 years earlier, that same amount of money could have bought you 500 billion eggs.
500 billion. An economy has officially broken free from mathematics at that point. And from memory.
And the human reality on the ground was just terrifying. We hear those anecdotes, which are well documented, about workers being paid twice a day in 1923.
Which sounds great until you realize why.
Right. It wasn't a benefit, it was an absolute necessity because the money lost value hour by hour.
They had to spend it instantly. Give us the coffee anecdote again, because that just nails the velocity of this destruction.
Okay, so a worker goes into a cafe, orders a cup of coffee. When he orders it, the price on the menu is, say, 5,000 marks. By the time he's finished drinking it, maybe 15, 20 minutes later, the price has already gone up. The bill arrives, and it's 8,000 marks.
In the time it took to drink the coffee.
The money was literally liquefying in their pockets, in their hands. And think what that does psychologically. People stop planning at all, which is essential for any kind of civilized economy, right?
Of course. Loans, savings, investment.
Forget it. If you can't trust the value of your money for the 20 minutes it takes to drink coffee, how can you possibly trust it for a 5-year loan or a 20-year mortgage or a lifetime pension? You can't. The future just dissolves.
And the sources point out this wasn't entirely unprecedented. Austria had gone through a similar, though maybe less extreme, collapse with its currency, the krona, just before Germany.
Yes, the Austrian experience was a grim foreshadowing. Fergusson mentions Frau Eisenmenger's diary, where she records the shock of seeing her supposedly safe, gilt-edged securities become utterly worthless.
Realizing the danger of trusting a government whose money means nothing, a government that's effectively dead.
And the Austrian collapse confirmed that shift in values too. Farmers started hoarding homegrown produce, wouldn't sell it to the cities for worthless paper, which led to hunger, and drove desperate urbanites to barter.
Trading family heirlooms for food.
Exactly. Imagine trading a gold watch passed down generations for a few sacks of potatoes, or swapping a grand piano for 3 months' worth of food. It shows you, when the medium of exchange dies, value just reverts to the immediate, the physical. Potatoes become more valuable than art, than history.
And this is really the core of Fergusson's argument in When Money Dies, isn't it? That transition from financial collapse to moral collapse. As the currency lost its meaning, the social contract, the moral compass of society just disintegrated alongside it.
It's the profound psychological impact. The destruction of the middle class wasn't just an economic statistic. It was the deliberate, or at least consequential, elimination of the nation's stabilizing heart. All those savings, the war loans people patriotically bought, insurance policies, pensions, just vanished. Gone.
Yeah, the sources cite these devastating figures for professional people, doctors, teachers, bank clerks. The pillars of civic life suddenly found their salaries could only feed their families for maybe a week or two. That trained bank clerk, the symbol of stability,
might earn an annual salary worth only £5 sterling. £5 for a year's skilled work.
That's more than just poverty. It's humiliation. It's the destruction of status, of dignity. It turns the most dependable, law-abiding citizens into the most desperate.
And that desperation, Fergusson argues, is what unleashes the absolute worst in human nature.
He writes that inflation unleashes such greed, violence, unhappiness, and hatred, largely bred from fear, as no society can survive uncrippled. How did that play out in daily life, beyond just losing savings?
So petty crime just exploded. Basic civility eroded completely. People started stripping lead from church roofs to sell for scrap, siphoning petrol from parked cars. No contract meant anything, no debt was secure, no promise held. When the measure of value itself dies, every agreement built on that measure dies too.
But maybe the most corrosive element was what Fergusson calls the Great Swindle, the way industrialists actually used the state, used the Reichsbank to enrich themselves. This wasn't just chaos, it was engineered corruption.
Yeah, this needs to be really clear. Big industrialists would go to the Reichsbank and take out huge loans at ridiculously low interest rates, say 100 million marks today.
Okay.
They'd immediately use that cash to buy raw materials, pay wages, acquire real assets. But the inflation was moving so fast, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks later, the real value of that 100 million mark debt had plummeted, maybe by 50%, maybe 90%.
Because the marks themselves were worth so much less.
Exactly. So they'd repay the loan with wheelbarrows full of practically worthless paper notes. They took on debt and valuable marks and paid it back in confetti.
So the state's inflation effectively erased most of their debt, allowing them to scoop up real assets, factories, machines, land at everyone else's expense. A state-sanctioned transfer of wealth from every saver in Germany to a select few.
It's predatory, and it creates this fundamental shift in moral psychology. Suddenly, acts against the state, things like tax evasion, hoarding food, illegal currency trading, they stop feeling like crimes.
They become rational acts of survival.
Right. When the state has fundamentally broken its trust with you by destroying your money, people feel justified, even obligated, to break the rules back just to survive. Fergusson notes, chillingly, it was a short step from dodging taxes to breaching the Ten Commandments.
And that line from the book just captures the end point. In hyperinflation, man's values became animal values. Immediate physical need trumped everything else.
Look at the inverted priorities he lists. A kilo of potatoes became worth more than the family silver. The trade-offs became grotesque. Fergusson writes, prostitution in the family was better than an infant corpse. Theft was preferable to starvation. Warmth was finer than honor. Clothing more essential than democracy. Food more needed than freedom.
When survival is the only currency left, things like freedom and democracy seem like unaffordable luxury.
They get jettisoned very quickly. And this rot, this decay, it reached the very highest levels. Even after the currency was stabilized, you had these massive corruption scandals.
Showing that corruption had become systemic.
It had infected ministers, bank directors, high-ranking Prussian officials. Bribery, which was apparently almost unknown before the war, became commonplace.
Why? Were they just greedy, or?
Fergusson suggests it was a mix. Some were driven by sheer demoralization, the feeling that nothing mattered anymore. Others by the simple fact that their post-stabilization salaries were still inadequate after years of chaos. But the critical point is the moral fabric had been torn, top to bottom. When the supposed standard bearers of civility are corrupt, who is left to trust?
And inevitably, all this suffering, this chaos, this loss of trust, it created the perfect breeding ground for political extremism.
Absolutely. Xenophobia, and particularly virulent anti-Semitism, exploded. People were desperate, ruined, and they needed scapegoats. They needed someone to blame for their life savings vanishing.
And the narrative formed.
The narrative became. Speculators on the stock exchange were clearly getting rich off this chaos. They were manipulating the collapsing currency. And in the minds of the ruined middle class, the terms stock exchange and Jews became fused, brutally connected.
Fergusson quotes sources showing that previously respectable, cultured Germans were openly advocating
the political murder of Jews as a legitimate weapon of defense. It's horrifying. The financial chaos fed directly, immediately, into the political violence and hatred that would define the next decade.
Okay, so the final, really destructive phase of the hyperinflation kicks into high gear in 1923. And the trigger this time was external, wasn't it? The French invasion of the Ruhr.
Yes, in January 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, because Germany had defaulted on reparation payments.
And Germany's response was passive resistance. What did that involve?
It meant telling the workers in the Ruhr miners, factory workers, to basically stop working, go on strike, don't cooperate with the occupiers. Politically, it was seen as a necessary patriotic stand.
But financially?
Financially, it was the final nail in the coffin. The German government decided to subsidize all these striking Ruhr workers, pay their wages while they remained idle. And how did they pay them?
Let me guess. The printing press.
You guessed it. Pouring gasoline on the fire they'd already started, paying for resistance with the only thing they had left in abundance. Utterly worthless paper marks.
And the pace of collapse just became unmanageable.
Totally impossible. The Reichsbank physically could not print notes fast enough to keep up with the mark's accelerating loss of value, which led to this bizarre situation: a critical shortage of actual cash. People ran out of physical banknotes, even as those notes were becoming worthless faster than ever.
Which led to frantic local measures.
Right. This is where you see the explosion of not-geld emergency money all across Germany.
So towns, companies started printing their own money.
Yes. Workers were demanding daily pay, sometimes twice daily. And since the Reichsbank couldn't supply enough official marks, local authorities, factories, businesses started issuing their own coupons, their own local paper script.
Which must have fragmented the economy even further.
Completely. It eroded any remaining authority of the central bank. You effectively had hundreds of local currencies circulating. Imagine the chaos for trade, for contracts. It just confirmed the total breakdown of centralized trust and order.
And this financial anarchy inevitably led to political collapse. Chancellor Kuno couldn't handle it.
He was totally overwhelmed. In August 1923, he basically went before Parliament and warned them. We're facing total financial collapse. We might not be able to even feed the population. The mark hit something like 1,800. No, wait, 1.8 million to the dollar then. Or is it pounds? The numbers get blurry.
The point is, it was astronomical. And his government fell
under the threat of general strike. Political consensus just evaporated, along with financial stability.
Gustav Stresemann took over. He managed to create some national unity, but the chaos was too far on.
He couldn't stop the financial bleeding, and he couldn't control the extremists bubbling up everywhere. Hitler down in Bavaria, the communists in Saxony. The political wreckage was almost total.
And this leads to the ultimate endpoint of monetary collapse: the abandonment of the rule of law for the rule of force.
It's the grim, logical conclusion. On September 26, 1923, President Friedrich Ebert, a social democrat, declared a nationwide state of emergency.
And what did that mean practically?
It meant effectively handing supreme power, executive and administrative, to the military, to General Hans von Sicht, the commander-in-chief of the Reichswehr.
So the civilian government basically abdicated.
They had to. Ebert's cabinet, under this state of emergency, suspended 7 key articles of the Weimar Constitution: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assembly, even the privacy of your own home. Gone. Suspended.
Germany effectively became a military dictatorship.
By necessity, yes. A political sacrifice made to prevent total societal dissolution. A dissolution brought on directly by the financial collapse. That, more than any statistic, shows the true power of hyperinflation to destroy a political order.
And of course, that weakness, that desperation was immediately seized upon.
Just 2 months later, November 1923, Adolf Hitler shamelessly uses the misery, the anger, the chaos caused by inflation, the sense of national humiliation to drum up support for his Bürgerbräukeler putsch in Munich.
The beer hall putsch.
Right. It failed, ultimately, but it showed clearly how the Weimar Republic's inability to manage its money had directly paved the road for extremists and ultimately for tyranny. But then, amidst this absolute chaos political breakdown, financial ruin, the turning point, arrives. And remarkably quickly. It's often called the Rentenmark miracle, November 1923.
What was the key? How did they slam the brakes on?
The first absolutely essential step was a decisive break with the past, a break with the illusion. The old paper mark was officially allowed to die. It lay to its final, almost mathematically neat rate, 1 millionth of its pre-war gold value.
So 12 zeros were knocked off. 1 Rentenmark equals 1 trillion old mark.
Exactly. It was legally recognized as dead, worthless. That cleared the slate.
And then came the new currency, the Rentenmark. Now, we know it wasn't backed by gold, which the old constitution required. Fergusson calls it radically unsound on paper. So why on earth did people accept it?
This is the genius, or perhaps the necessary trick of it. The Rentenmark, which was a modification of an earlier idea, the Roggenmark or Reimark, wasn't backed by gold, true. It was backed notionally by mortgages on all of Germany's agricultural land and industrial property.
So, backed by tangible assets, real wealth.
Precisely. Unlike the old paper mark, which was ultimately backed only by government promises and debt, the Rentenmark felt grounded, rooted in the actual soil and factories of Germany. It had a psychological backing, even if the mechanics were complex.
So it was less about the technical backing and more about restoring confidence, a confidence trick that worked because the government also changed its behavior.
That's the critical part. The success depended almost entirely on the public's psychological acceptance that this new currency was stable value, and crucially, that the government would stop the printing press.
And did they?
They did. And the effect was instantaneous. The velocity of circulation, remember the coffee anecdote, people spending money frantically. It slowed from a mad gallop, as Fergusson puts it, to a sedate walk. People started holding on to money again. Confidence, not the specific backing, was the magic ingredient.
And the man credited with enforcing this iron discipline was Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, the new currency commissioner. His methods were famously direct.
Yeah, Schacht's story is legendary. He supposedly stabilized the currency from a tiny office, a former cleaning lady's cupboard, mainly through decisive action and phone calls. His brilliance was recognizing the core problem wasn't a lack of notes, but a total lack of faith.
So what was his main action?
Stop the printing press. Absolutely refused to give the government any more credit through inflation. Force a balanced budget. Stability was achieved simply by choosing truth, fiscal restraint, living within means over the inflationary illusion that you could print your way to prosperity.
But this return to reality, this truth, it had an immediate and brutal cost, didn't it? The artificial boom fueled by inflation had to end.
Absolutely. This was the cold bath, the price of honesty. The government slammed the brakes on credit. Banks were forced to call in loans they'd made easily during the inflation. Bankruptcies just soared. The Frankfurter Zeitung newspaper had actually predicted this awful debacle would follow stabilization.
And unemployment, which inflation had sort of masked.
It came roaring back. Mass unemployment was the direct, painful consequence of stabilization. Factories closed because they couldn't survive without the constant subsidy of cheap loans and devalued wages. Union unemployment, already high at nearly 19% in October 23, it soared past 2 million by early 1926. The bloated public sector railways, post office finally had to slim down its overstaffed workforce.
So incredible social pain in the short term. Yet politically, Fergusson argues this harsh reality actually had a strange benefit.
It did, paradoxically. The stabilization, however brutal, calmed the nationalist fever that had peaked during the collapse. Fergusson notes that the Rentenmark became Hitler's greatest enemy. Once the immediate, desperate struggle for daily survival subsided, once people could actually buy a loaf of bread for the same price 2 days running, the fertile ground for extremist agitators started to dry up. They thrive on chaos. Restoring sound money, even at great cost, restored a measure of political sanity.
So if we pull it all together, Fergusson's account, when money dies, it really functions as this powerful moral parable, doesn't it, for any modern state?
It's absolutely not just a story about economics or statistics. It's fundamentally about the deep connection between fiscal discipline, honesty in government, and social stability. It shows, maybe more clearly than any other historical episode, how destroying the trusted medium of exchange. It unleashes greed, violence, fear, and it corrodes the moral habits that actually sustain a free society.
And Fergusson's conclusion is so striking. Inflation doesn't start with the printing press itself. It starts with pride, the belief that man can outvote the laws of economics and ethics alike.
Mm-hmm. And this history just profoundly affirms the wisdom of the American founders, doesn't it? They lived through their own, albeit smaller, version of this with the Continental.
They understood that honest money is honest government. That link was clear to them. And once that honesty is compromised, the nation's liberty isn't far behind.
That constitutional mandate for sound money, for gold and silver, it wasn't some weird economic theory or superstition. It came from a deep moral conviction that the government should not have the arbitrary power to wipe out the savings, the work, the future of its citizens through monetary manipulation.
So the Weimar experience stands as this stark warning. No republic can survive long if it treats its money purely as a political tool. You know, whether the goal is to avoid unemployment today or pay for popular subsidies or just kick the debt can down the road.
Instead of treating it as a sacred moral trust between the government and the people.
Yeah. that core conflict in Weimar, it was between trying to avoid unemployment through spending versus trying to avoid insolvency through restraint.
And by dodging that choice, by postponing the inevitable reckoning for years and years through inflation, Germany eventually got both: mass unemployment and insolvency, and political collapse. The stabilization, painful as it was, showed that the price of facing reality was infinitely less than the cost of maintaining that destructive illusion.
So that brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to consider drawing directly from this history. If that fundamental conflict, avoiding unemployment versus avoiding insolvency, is still arguably a dominant political tension in many countries today, what hidden costs might modern societies be racking up by continuously postponing that reckoning? And maybe more importantly, how might that delay be quietly eroding the bedrock of trust upon which our own democracies depend?
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
See you next time.